Hello, we'll start the webinar in about one more minute as folks start to file in. Hello, and thank you for joining this month's webinar on demand trends in higher education. I'm Pete Starrett, a partner at Gray Associates and filling in for our CEO, Bob Atkins, this month. And I have on me Russ Natosi, who's an ex-CMO at NCU, and will be walking you through a marketing and enrollment assessment section of our webinar today. And he'll introduce himself in more detail when we get to that section later in the webinar. Quick housekeeping items. If you do have any questions as we're going through the webinar here for either one of us, please feel free to type those in. There should be a little chat section at the bottom of the page that you can click on and type questions. We'll try to answer them along the way if we see them quick enough. Otherwise, we'll answer them at the end of today's webinar. And as always, this is being recorded, so you'll be able to share this with folks or watch it again, and you'll have access to the slides once we're finished today as well. So with that, let's dive in. So many of you who are joining today are joining for the first time. So we'd like to start our webinars off just briefly introducing Gray. And we're a strategy consulting firm with lots of data focused entirely now in higher education. And this image you see on the screen here essentially portrays all of the data we have, as well as the types of services we essentially do using all of this data. So we'll be touching on one of those aspects today within student demand as we walk through the inquiries and the Google search trends. But we also have lots of other market data revolving around competition. We've got employment, several sources of data actually within employment, including wages, placement rates, employer requirements, and we're actually expanding that database to get more details into the job postings as well. Then I touched on student demand, but we have a lot of the competition metrics, which include IPEDS data that we've actually done a bit of enhancements to be able to track really where schools are actually offering the programs. But also it's a way of, or part of our enhancements has been trying to allocate this to where completions essentially come from in terms of where they're actually living when they choose to go to a school. So that's part of all of the data we have that we've put together to do a number of projects related to program evaluations. We also do more custom work using your internal data to assess the economics for programs, and we sum all this up into our integrated program analysis. But we also are able to do more custom projects related to things like pricing, as well as any other types of projects that you might have to do ad hoc analysis. So starting to dive into the data here, as I mentioned, we've obviously got, we'll be touching on student demands, but one of the key projects we work on is assessing our client's program portfolio, which includes new programs, but in particular, it's a very detailed analysis into looking at a client's current program portfolio. And we've created an integrated process that includes internal and external data, as well as having the right people and process wrapped around that. So I mentioned markets, but it's also very important that, or just as important really, that you include the mission of the programs and the academic standards, as well as the economics of those programs, which much of this is data that you already have. It's a matter of wrapping it up into the right system so that you're able to see this by program and in a summary dashboard all in one place is obviously extremely helpful when you have that data at your fingertips. And then, as I mentioned, wrapped around all of this is having the right people and the right process. So you really want the folks working with these programs every day, making those decisions, because they're going to have some qualitative knowledge that just doesn't show up in any database. So having the right judgments in the room when you're making these decisions are very important. And then the processes used to make those decisions is as important as anything else in this. So with that, we're going to dive into one section of the markets today, student demand, and specifically within that, the inquiry data and the Google search trends. So we'll flow through the inquiries pretty quickly here, and we'll touch on, at a high level, what those trends are looking like. And then we'll start to dive into the details a little bit more, and then we'll touch briefly on the Google search trends. One other topic we're going to cover before I hand it off to Russ to talk about the marketing and enrollment assessment is price optimization, which also seems to be a pretty hot topic in higher education these days. So with that, first, all of our charts, our bar charts anyways, are going to look a lot like this. So in terms of how you read these, you'll see, albeit January will be the only bar for 2020, but you'll have essentially three colors of bars. 2018 is shown in green, 2019 is in that crimson color, and then 2020 is in blue. And those will indicate each of the years of data we're sharing. We typically include 3 years on these charts. And then the focus of today is really looking at the results from January. So as an example, nationally, looking at all programs and award levels in our inquiry database, inquiries were up 2% in January compared to January of last year in 2019. Which, if we look, is actually now starting to offset where we saw a little dip in November and December of last year compared to the prior year. So while 2019 as a whole looked great, we'd actually seen a little bit of a decline that it's obviously a great sign coming into the new year that that's now reverse direction. And then going a step further, we always touch on conversions as well. And conversions are, to define it here, are essentially the inquiries that move on to the next step in the funnel or the next stage. So they're not necessarily enrollments, but these are all of the inquiries that move to that next stage in terms of filling out some type of application. And what we see here actually is that in our most recent mature month, October of last year, it's now down 12% after a pretty strong run of consecutive months of growth compared to the prior year. And what we mean by mature is we count conversions based on the month that the inquiry came in. So those numbers you see for October are the inquiries that came in October. Those are the amounts that converted, which may have happened potentially after October and could have even happened in January. And so what we've seen is about 90% of, at least in our inquiry database, 90% of those inquiry or conversions tend to convert within or by that third or fourth month. So, that number could go up a little bit, but 12% down from last year is hard to imagine that it'll actually catch last year's totals, which, if this is a trend that we begin to see is not a good sign, even though inquiries are up year over year. We obviously want them moving on to that next stage. And then the immature months, November and December, certainly have a bit of ground to make up, more so in November since it's, more mature at this point, but not a good trend that we're seeing in our database at this point in time. And then as we look at the average price per inquiry, these are for those pay per lead types of inquiries. We see, while it looks positive, the price is up 3% year over year. That's also not a great sign. And that now it costs more to buy these types of leads, essentially. So, that could mean that, these are higher quality potentially. And maybe when January is more mature, more of these will convert, which, obviously offsets some of that when you get to your price per enrollment, but not a great sign that we're seeing conversions are starting to trend downward and the price is going up for these types of inquiries. So now we'll jump to look at the shift between online and on campus. And for those of you who have been on many of these webinars, online's obviously been the bright spot as we've looked at this data for the past, well, at least not the last 2 months, but certainly most of last year. Online has been increasing and continues, or really, again, changes that decline we saw to now it's up 4% in January. So again, a good start to the year 2020 in terms of online inquiries, but as we look at on ground, not as great, and some wacky numbers actually we had last year. I should mention there is an unknown category, which certainly picks up a lot of the inquiries as well, but at least for the ones where we know they were specifically looking for on-campus. It continues to be down as we look at each of these months. And if you look at 2019, they're all beneath the green bars for those same months in 2018. Now, again, sort of drilling down into this a little further. As always, we track our 5 largest programs in our database, and this is referring to the programs with the most inquiries since we started tracking these in January of 2012. And here, and we've seen, obviously many shifts in these programs throughout the years now, but medical assisting is one that seems to be increasing finally. But I've been here long enough to have seen that program take huge hits when, in particular, a lot of the for-profit schools were having issues, and those inquiries for medical assisting were declining every month for more than a year. But now that one's starting to increase, and we're starting to see consecutive months of growth for that particular program. However, the rest of our big 5 programs decreased in the month of January compared to 2019, which, these are all still going to be very large programs, but, not a great sign when our biggest programs are starting to decline, because, I mean, these are areas where many schools have, huge enrollments in some of these particular program areas. Now, if we eliminate size and look at our fastest growing programs, again, starting to see some similar programs pop up each month as we look at this. Hospitality, administration, and management's one where we've seen, and entrepreneurship is one that grew quite a bit last year, I believe, when we were looking at, this data each month. And then we have information technology, legal assisting is one that continues to show up, in nursing assistant. So a pretty interesting set of programs here in terms of our 5 fastest growing programs. And that there's not many similarities across these 5 programs. You've got 5 pretty unique programs on this list here in terms of areas that grew in January. And then finally, in this section where we've got our big 5 cities that we also track. While inquiries overall are up, not so much in our largest cities here in terms of when we look at the inquiry data for those. So New York, once again, one of the largest markets, but declined in 2019 in January compared to 2018, and now saw another decline in January of 2020 compared to 2019. So 2 consecutive years of declines in inquiries to start the years. LA, however, actually pretty strong compared to all of the, well, other than Houston, but growth in both years at 9%. And Houston, I mentioned, also grew double digits in each of the last 2 years in January. So great signs in those markets. If you're marketing for programs in those areas, it's obviously a great sign. So now jumping into our Google data. First, we'll touch on, we basically track this information in 2 ways. One is based on program and one based on brands. So on the program side, we're tracking for the 200 largest programs that we're pulling in here. That's based on completions. We're tracking about 20 to 25 keywords associated with each of those programs and the search volumes for those keywords. And what we see here is a lot like what we saw in the inquiries, in that January is up. It's also up for the Google searches for these larger programs as well. Although it's up a bit more. I think we had 2% inquiry growth in January. We've actually got 9% in Google search growth for the month of January based on those program keywords, which again continues. I mean, if we look at 2019 as a whole, every month was up compared to the prior year for our Google search volumes based on programs. And then what we have here are the fastest growing programs for the month of January. So we're looking at the year-over-year change in terms of the percentage, which is what that green bar is showing. And then sort of hidden behind that is the total volume of searches, probably not the easiest to read. But for example, in that first program, we see finance grew the most in January at 121%, which this was also the program that grew the most and was over 100% in December's volumes as well. And then we see the blue bar behind it. It's roughly just over 100,000 searches we have for that we're pulling in for the keywords associated with finance in the month of January. So, that's obviously massive growth. And then, as we look at some of the other programs, again, sort of a unique set of programs in that, finance is unlike many of the others we see on the list here. You've got some lower trades types of programs showing up in your skincare, nail technician, electrician, barbering. Pretty interesting programs, maybe not necessarily programs, but certainly it's an interesting list here. And many of these we tend to see popping up in each of the months we've been doing this now. Then on the other side, we're again tracking keywords for brands as well. So we've increased the size of this database to now track 350 brands that we're collecting. And we've got around 7 keywords for each of those brands for colleges and universities. And here again, sort of in line, albeit not as much with the other sources, but for those 350 brands, we're seeing positive growth in the searches for these. But last year did not look quite as great as some of the months earlier in the year that we saw last year. It started to sort of, we saw some declines later in the year. But again, for the second consecutive month, as we look at the fastest growing brands, in December, we saw LSU for making the national championship, and now we see them with massive growth for winning the national championship. So it clearly pays to have a really good football team when it comes to getting people to search for your brand. And then we certainly have some other schools here. So showing up on the list, we've got one other, Orange Coast College, up 117%. Holy Cross, very close to where I am actually in Worcester, up 83%. And then several others up over 20 and 30% on the list here. So this gives you a sense of, this can be very helpful information to see where your brand tracks compared to other brands. And obviously you can drill down into the news to see specifically what might be driving some of these searches, which are not always a good thing when you see the growth in your brand searches. So that takes us through our demand trends. Now what I'll do is briefly walk through price optimization, mainly because this has been a pretty hot topic in higher education these days, and certainly one that we've been hearing a lot about. And we've done several projects related to value propositions and essentially optimizing those offers in the past couple of years now. And this is one where, education's an interesting industry in that price just seems to be going up every single year, but, not a ton of effect in terms of, obviously there's been changes in enrollments, but, it never seems to stop. It just keeps increasing. I remember when I was still in high school looking at prices, and they're a lot different now than when I was looking back when I was in high school. So it's a pretty interesting space in that regard. But one of the keys is that price isn't really the main thing that students or prospective students are really looking for nowadays. And this is part of where I think, we're looking at the overall value proposition in terms of what it is we're offering to students. Whether, brand's obviously a huge component of that and what people think of the brand. But then in terms of, what you offer, whether it be online versus on ground versus low residency programs. There are a lot of different things you can include in your offer related to price as well, whether it be scholarships, fees, and how those essentially help or hurt you in terms of your offer. And honestly, we can't really talk about the results, but it's very interesting what you see when you do this type of research in terms of what will really steer a prospect away from choosing a potential school. Could be a very low in terms of when you think of cost to you or of value to you, but means a lot more to the student in terms of, when they're making that decision. It can really turn them off to picking a particular school. And it might be as simple as just removing something in terms of what you're offering for a particular student. And I know Russ, and Russ may chime in as we go through the slides here, but he's certainly done a bit of work on this as well. So, if you have questions, feel free to direct them to each of us. But, and I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add, Russ, before I dive in.
Well, I think that's the only comment I'll make, is that until you actually do this kind of work, you really don't know what's going to pop as a huge differentiator. And once you've got that and your ability to communicate it consistently, you can really take advantage of the upside. But this is insightful beyond belief. It's just one of those things I can't recommend strongly enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, as we get into the approach, really, I mean, there are a lot of ideas, and generating those ideas is really the first step in terms of, I mean, we like to review it with the faculty, the administration, and then with students as well, and focus groups to really find out, what do we believe that the most important items are when students are choosing or to come to a school ultimately. And we go through that, I mentioned in focus groups, but obviously as you get to further and further down the process of being able to analyze this, you've got to come up with your shorter list of attributes to test. So you start with very high level, and then what we do is we ultimately get into prioritizing that list, and then coming up with a survey, specifically a max diff survey that, and I'll walk through this as well, but ultimately that presents each of the respondents with a list of attributes and the ones they believe are most important or least important, or most appealing, least appealing, and they choose from that list. And it allows you to then, obviously using a stats provider or, some sort of system to be able to handle all this data, you're able to then see really what students value the most, so that you can then take that, starting with a longer list, now you've got a shorter list, and then ultimately you've got your 7 to 10 final attributes that you're able to put into your final discrete choice survey, which again, really provides you with pretty important metrics once you've got the results from that survey, to be able to see really what is most important and actually quantify those results in terms of changes in enrollments based on percentage changes. And then, if you're able to have the financials built around that as well, you can factor in sort of your variable economics to determine, based on this change in demand, what does that mean in terms of a change on our revenue, with those built-in assumptions of, if we move price down this much, what does that do to our demand? And then that new price with our new demand, what does that mean for our revenue? And really just briefly here, I'll touch on, we've got some examples. I mean, this is our max diff analysis where, there's an example here of, you've got, again, this is all illustrative, but, and not specific to schools, but essentially you've got one task that you're asking respondents to go through several pages where they're basically asked, like you see here, to choose the one that's most appealing to them and the one that's least appealing. So that allows us to quantify essentially the ones that are, you'll see at the bottom of the chart, which ones in terms of how it affects a student's choice, which ones are the most and least appealing based on the scores they receive. And, whether or not that's statistically significant based on how far it varies from the average. So honestly, something that's very low in a score means it's not very appealing, or could actually be something that turns them away from choosing to go to a school potentially. So, and then on the other end, obviously, we've got a movies example here, but more movies I like, but that'd be something that's very important to offer to someone, would be something as an example at the top. And so what this allows you to do is, you can start with a list of 25 to 30 attributes, and then really start to figure out what is most important, and maybe even more attributes than that, to then see from that long list what is the most important things to offer to a student. And the other thing is, in these particular surveys, is you do want to have things that you actually can change, that are actionable. You obviously don't want to test something that is fixed, and you're not able to change, because again, you want to find out, for things that are actionable items, what is the right offer for those. And then just touching on these two briefly, you've got your discrete choice task. So once you've chosen your 7 or so or 8 attributes, you put them into a survey where they're asked to then choose, based on levels you set for each of those attributes, which one would you choose based on, you're comparing brands, obviously, to your competitors. You've got tuitions that vary from screen to screen as they're making their decisions, as well as any of the other metrics you might or attributes you might have. So pretty standard ones here, like fees, books, scholarships, but there could be, flexibility. I can take a class anytime I want type of things you could offer in here versus, set schedule would be other things as examples that you could include here that ask them to then choose and, quantify how strongly they feel about that choice. And then this allows you to, with a stats team, build a simulator essentially that allows you to go in and for all of those metrics and brands, toggle and play around with those to see, what are the essentially best case scenarios or most optimal offers essentially in terms of, demand and new starts and dollars and margin. And, that all results in a summary you see like you have on the screen here, where, I mean, we can literally see, if our scholarships, if we offer $5,000 in scholarships, and again, these are illustrative, but demand increases 66%. And then what you need to do is figure out, okay, but now we're actually discounting $5,000. So is that enough of an increase in demand to offset that we're losing $5,000 for all of those new starts? So, a lot goes into this to be able to see the demand. And then, you can create these charts. And what we're not showing here is obviously then play around with it to really determine what is the most optimal offer at your school. So I know I went through this quickly, but I wanted to save time for Russ to get through our marketing enrollment assessment as well. So I'm actually going to pass the screen share off to him, and he's going to take you through this section here.
And I just got to make sure I pull up the right one here. So I think we've got it. Okay. So thanks, everyone. I'm Russ Natosi. I had worked with Gray on and off over the years, usually when I was in between a role. And I've now am permanently without a role in that I've retired from North Central University, where I was last employed. Let me tell you a little bit about my background, which may be helpful. Spent the first 24 years of my career at AT&T, a lot of operational roles and some very large marketing roles that I had as well, both on the brand side and direct roles as well. We've had an interesting set of opportunities after I retired, after 24 years. I went and worked some time in telecom and did some work at AOL as well, doing their first brand management position there. And then I found my way into higher education, working with a past, I'm seeing some things flash on the screen. Can you guys hear me okay?
Sorry, Russ, we can hear you. I was going to wait till you finish your intro, but you just need to swap displays. We're seeing the presenter view.
Okay, now I just got to remember where the swap display is.
There you go. Sorry.
There we go. No, I'm glad you said it. Thank you very much. Long story short, ended up in higher education, 3 different institutions where I was the chief marketing officer. The last one was at North Central University, which was an online graduate institution, pretty much all doctorate and master's degrees. We increased our overall student population by about 10% over the time that I was there, launched about 40 new programs, and most importantly, we increased revenue and profitability pretty dramatically by focusing on the right programs and using a lot of Gray's data to help us make those determinations, as well as the ability to launch the new programs that were taking over some of the old historically large programs that were no longer working well. MBA probably being the single biggest example of that. MBA was huge, but we saw so much churn and retention problems that de-minimizing anything associated with it was kind of the idea, and then launching the new programs to offset it. And those programs continue to track well. In the year that I've been gone, every new program projection that they had has been surpassed. So we set some pretty good capabilities for the long term. But the important part about this was that in every job I walked into, including this one at North Central, I conducted a marketing and enrollment assessment. It allowed me to take a look at the organization to see what was needed, where the risks were, and the opportunities for true improvement. So we've turned that into an ability to help other institutions move forward, and it's been pretty insightful for how we've been able to do that. So let me explain a little bit about the process. The purpose and the scope is to conduct a third-person expert interview and review of your marketing and or of your admissions practices to really identify where your strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities are, and for opportunities to improve. Some institutions want to look just at marketing. Some want to look at just enrollment or admissions. Some want to do both. And it's really any opportunity is available. But it all comes down to really focusing on people, the strategy of the organization and the attention that it has, the type of process that's used. And like when you look at student acquisition, it's all the different channels, people or external resources that are utilized to go after it, your costs associated with it for not only your cost for inquiry, but your cost for application, your cost for enrollment, and ultimately your overall return on investment. Most organizations have a communications component that might be internal and or external. It may include social media from a non-paid side. And then there's program management. Some institutions spend a lot of time with their marketing team actively involved in determining new programs and where to launch them. In other schools, it's entirely done by faculty and the two never cross. Where the integration takes place is where I see the most value coming from. Same kind of thing with internal collaboration. Is marketing talking to anybody besides marketing? Sometimes that's not the case. In other cases, it's very collaborative. Same kind of approach in enrollment. So let me just continue to go into more detail here. When you're looking at marketing, there's a ton of details that can be used. One item that came up earlier in the max diff pricing idea was, how are promotional offers utilized? Or are they utilized? You saw a $5,000 scholarship that was included in that example, but there's many different ones to utilize, including waivers on fees that might normally be in place. So how are they used and how effective are they utilized? When you get into so much of what happens in the collaboration side, it's so insightful about why people like what's getting done. And I'll show you why that's important in a moment. On the enrollment side, same kind of idea. You start with people, and most importantly, you get into things like spans of control. I've seen some institutions that have had ridiculously small spans of control, which is expensive, but very controllable. And others where the span of control was so loose that they weren't getting all the value back from it. So, where is it at this institution? And is it done with a portion of, segmentation, or is every enrollment counselor responsible for every program? Which means they're all pretty good at everything, but not great at any one thing. Might be an insight that comes from that. What type of training is done? How is it done? How is it continually reviewed and enhanced upon? Competitor knowledge is really important, but it's also important not to ever talk about your competitor negatively, more about how do you talk about your programs more positively in light of your competitors and maybe some of the things that they don't do as well as you do. Admission strategy gets into an awful lot of this, and it gets into things like, well, how do you pay your folks? What's that impact on your tenure? How much of that is something that you want to be able to continue doing going forward or not? So that's kind of the what. The how we get it done is by literally coming out to your institution and conducting face-to-face interviews. And we find it very important to do this kind of in two different tranches. One is really on the marketing and admissions professionals that you have in your organization and what they do. And then the second one is really looking at the institutional leaders across the institution. A lot of times we find that the folks inside of marketing and enrollment really believe that they're doing a great job, but we've got folks like in the CFO's organization that doesn't believe that because they just haven't heard the whole story of what's really happening. We've found in some cases where we've turned people that were not advocates at all, in fact, actually detrimental to any new changes that marketing wouldn't want to do, just because they didn't understand what they were doing. Once we found that you could tie the two pieces together, those same individuals became the best advocates for new investments that were needed. So again, one of those insights that can come from discussions with institutional folks and leaders. And then from that, we go away. Usually it's myself and an analyst that will take and look at all your materials that you provided to us, either at the time we were interviewing or afterwards. And then we go through that and review it to see what the insights are. But we always know that questions come up when we go through that process, and it always requires some additional follow-ups. And that's really important to make sure we're clear on what we're hearing and understanding. Then we write it up, tell you exactly what we believe is the most appropriate things to do going forward, and then we come back and provide those insights. We have a good discussion around what we learned. The way we actually do that in the way of providing those kind of inputs back to you is you get a high-level executive summary, which is, I think, somewhat helpful, but the real value in this comes in the details. And we've got a couple pages that go into each part of the organization. So as an example, for each one of these things, we give it a red, yellow, or green. Green, it's a strong strength, don't touch it. Basically, just keep going, feed the beast. Yellow is where there's improvement opportunities, and risks are typically just that. You either got a revenue risk or some kind of regulatory potential risk that's coming up in compliance, but it's we don't see too many of these, but when we see them, we want to be very clear about what those are. And then with each one of these, so just talking about the marketing organization, there's a page on red, yellow, green opportunities. What did we learn? What did we hear? And then following that is, here are the recommendations just on the marketing organization that we would suggest going forward. And we do that on every component that we look at. So marketing strategy, again, another red, yellow, green that we would go through. And then following that, here's a bunch of improvement opportunities with the suggested priorities that we would make. Some of these change, obviously, as we go through the discussions, additional learning comes about, but it's we found this to be extremely helpful for organizations that are trying to create a learning path to improvement and really change the results. In some cases, it's just a concern that an organization might have is, I know we've got pretty good marketing, but do we really have great people or great agencies doing the work for us? And that's something that we can help you determine as you're going through the process. In other cases, it's much more broad open and saying, I know I've got to do something and just where do I start? This allows us the ability to give you focus and where do you want to go forward with that? So let me just pause there. Ned, have we gotten any questions?
Not at this point, Russ. You can keep on moving.
Okay, all right. So the typical process that we go through on this takes about 4 to 6 weeks. And we can, again, customize it depending on what you are really trying to look at. Is it just marketing, just enrollment, or is it really the intersection of two coming together to give you the best opportunity? One sales point that I'll make for myself is that I've worked in a lot of different organizations where marketing and enrollment have been separate. Some have brought it together under a leader that causes that to work better, and some have kept it totally separate. When I've last done it, the last 2 times, I've had both marketing and enrollment reporting into me directly. We've knocked down a lot of walls. No longer did we have the opportunity where someone was saying, geez, marketing sends us lots of inquiries, but they're really kind of crap. Or the converse of that, the marketing guy saying, we give you guys great leads and nobody converts them. Well, the reality is when you're talking together, you actually understand what's causing the opportunities and or the deficits in the process. And then you don't only any longer just people throwing arguments back and forth, they're collaboratively working together to get to the end result. So I'll stop with the sales pitch at that point and just say, if you've got questions or interest in talking further, I'd be happy to go through this with you and talk about how we'd apply this to your specific institution. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Russ.
Back to you.
Yeah, so I will take the share back here. But really that summarizes or completes, I should say, today's webinar. So really just to summarize, we touched on the inquiries and the Google searches. Both are growing when we look at totals nationally. Conversions, however, not looking as great as we're starting to see some of the more recent mature months. Those numbers are going down with certainly a mix between our big 5 cities and our 5 largest programs. We only had 1 growing. And as always, having a really good football team certainly helps the brand searches, but overall brand searches for our 350 brands were flat. So with that, we'll open it up for questions. Obviously, we're very high on including as much data as you can as you're making program decisions or even decisions about what markets to go into or what markets to simply market in. So, if you have any questions that come up to you, maybe not today, but in the future, or you'd like to speak about anything or that anything we can help you on, whether it be a project or even just talk through something with you, we'd be happy to communicate with you. Or if you have anything you'd like to speak with Russ about, I'm sure he'd be happy to talk you through anything that he walked through today. And lastly, future webinars, we do have our annual masterclass starting up again, actually in a week now, where Bob will be back at the mic walking through understanding student demand. So obviously talking through much of what we talked about today, but walking through how that comes together in evaluating programs. and what other databases we have and how we're transforming that data to really get it to be by program and as a part of those assessments. And those master classes will go on for, I think we've got about 6 parts to walk through each of the categories: employment, competition, and then we'll get into economics, and finally how we bring it all together in the last 2. And then, as always, we've got our monthly demand trends webcasts that will continue to move forward with each month. So let's see, we've got, I think this is a question for you, Russ. What type of results in enrollment growth or marketing conversions have you seen with this type of review methodology?
So what I can tell you is, and it really depends on the organization and how they're going to follow through on the implementation. But when I've done this and worked with schools to continue following through on that implementation, it's been pretty substantial changes. Sometimes it's a change of a personnel that makes a big difference. A lot of times it's process and approach to getting that done. Sometimes the impact is on enrollment results being up, or it's really down to a profitability issue. In that you're focusing on the right programs, not just every program, as one example to getting that done. But the types of increases, the kind of work that we did at North Central, I think was paramount to getting this done. North Central was successful, and one of the reasons that I retired at the time that I did is that we sold North Central University to National University. And a lot of that was based upon the changes and the diligence that we put into both marketing and enrollment, and the growth path that we had from all the new programs that we had launched. So I hope that helps answer the question a little bit.
Okay, well, doesn't seem like any other questions are, well, actually, I scratched that. Let's see. So with the fastest growing occupations data, how will Gray handle the new IPEDS classification? So that actually is a piece that we are constantly working on. And there is certainly going to be a number of projects that we have as these new codes come out, these CIP codes, but we have crosswalks that obviously are all behind the scenes that we're constantly working on enhancing. So, I mean, that's something we'll have to, and we've already started going through tracking what some of the new areas are going to be, so that we can assign the occupations to them. So it's hard to say right now what it's going to look like, but I mean, this will be a full-blown project for us to essentially take what we're doing is taking all of those occupation codes and allocating them to the CIP codes. So as we get those new codes, we will essentially just update those allocations to include all the new things. But there'll probably be a bit of an iterative process to be able to handle all of that. And once we do have that done and completed, we'll certainly share, what the results look like and how we sort of handled that.
So we've got one more question here from Michael Ortel. It's about how to enroll in the masterclass, Pete.
Oh yeah, so that is, and Ned's probably more classified to answer this, but you should be able to go to our website, and just like you essentially subscribe to this webinar, you'll be able to subscribe to the masterclass series.
Actually, it's a completely different process. We are not offering the masterclass through our website. We are kind of keeping this down to just people that have attended our webinars in the past. So you will be receiving an email blast, probably going out around 4 o'clock this afternoon. We're trying to keep this into a more of an intimate setting. So it's kind of just like a special invite only that the people that have attended these webinars and people that are on our database will be receiving.
And then the next question was, if you enroll for one, do you get the rest? Or
if you enroll for one, you'll be automatically registered for the next 5, and you'll be receiving automatic updates. And just to be clear, the masterclass is free of charge.
The other question I saw was, again, from Michael, about, based on your experience, do most marketing teams spend too much time at the front end of the enrollment funnel and neglect effort on pushing students through further down in the funnel? In a broad statement, yes, I think that's fair. And it's kind of a twofer. the time that's spent on the front end is really determining, what effectively converts. And if you continue just producing inquiries that aren't converting, then you're wasting a lot of time and energy. Even down funnel, you're not going to be able to do a lot with those if you're doing nothing new in the front end. So it's a bit of both, but there's an awful lot of remarketing that schools don't invest time in doing, which is the down funnel work. It can be done with retargeting people on Facebook or Google. It can be done through separate email campaigns, but I find a lot of folks just don't ever harvest those old inquiries. They let them age and they just get older and don't get work. So great question.
All right. Well, Russ, I thank you very much for joining us this month. So it looks like the questions may be slowing, but again, feel free to, you can find almost anyone at Gray on our website, grayassociates.com, if you do want to follow up with any more questions you have or schedule a follow-up call. So I once again, thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.